If you clicked on this video, I just wanted to say thank you and subscribe for some more Red Dead content. This is not stuff that I normally upload, and for some provided context, this series or these types of videos are basically just compilations of videos that are already up on the channel. Just making it easier for people to binge watch everything when it comes to character analysis or breakdowns or deeper looks at relationships from one character to another. Just to make it all easier and more digestible, and to combine the individual videos as more of a complete series as a long form video, so that way you could just put on in the background, go to sleep, go to work, do whatever you need to do. This video specifically is all centered around Arthur's sickness. We talk about guarma. Would things be different if Arthur never contracted tuberculosis? Did Arthur ever really care for Colm and Dutch's rivalry? Was that really his fight? Did Arthur manage to redeem himself by the end of the game? And to kind of wrap it all up, Red Dead Redemption 2's story isn't the story that you think it is. But yeah, just enjoy the video and let me know if you prefer them to be longer than an hour and a half, because that's what they're kind of sitting at right now. But there's chapters if you want to jump around. Anyways, I'll shut up. Enjoy the video. Guarma, the primary location in which the missions in the 5th chapter takes place. Arthur Morgan is trapped on the island after the events of the banking the old American art mission, and it's only after trying to escape a failed bank robbery and finding refuge on a boat that ends up sinking does Arthur Morgan, Dutch Vanderlyn, Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and Micah Bell find themselves stranded on this island. Guarma is an interesting location because out of the entire story, it is the only location you cannot return back to. It's an exotic location that certain species of parrots, snakes, and crabs can be found, and it's a very pivotal part of the game's story. If you played the campaign, then you're well aware of the events of Guarma. It's the first time that Arthur, with the exception of the cold-blooded murder of Angelo Bronte, that Arthur witnesses firsthand Dutch's deteriorating mental state, his ability to kill in cold blood and come up with any excuse need be in order to cover up his tracks. Not only is Guarma interesting for its exotic location and the fact that you can't return to it, unlike all the other locations throughout the game's story, but it can feel almost as if it derails the rest of the game's story. In these chapters, Arthur and the rest of the gang members that are stranded on the island get caught in the middle of a revolution. The island is pretty much a sugar plantation run by Colonel Alberto Fustar, a man that's known for savage brutality against the locals that are now starting to rise up against his oppression. So the Vanderlyn gang isn't only trying to escape the law that was ruthlessly pursuing them back in Saint Denis, but now they find themselves in the midst of a heated revolutionary war, which throughout the duration of this chapter, for the most part, it feels like that revolution takes the wind out of the sails of the focus on the Vanderlyn gang. It goes from them all working together, trying to rob the rich and utilize the riches that they captured to create a new life for themselves, pursuing the beautiful island of Tahiti or virgin lands in the west. However, with the boat sinking with all the money that they captured from the Saint Denis Bank, it feels almost like they're starting back to the very beginning. At least that's how it all seems on the surface. Guarma is very pivotal. Even though on the surface it looks like it derails the rest of the story, as I was saying, it's very pivotal because in the mean moments, in the middle of all this, you can really see Dutch's mentality start to shift. And not only does it shift, but you have the very first instance where Arthur by himself experiences Dutch kill someone in cold blood. I'd argue this is actually the second time. The first time would have been Angelo Bronte, where that was displayed in front of the entire gang. But in this isolated incident where Dutch decides to kill this old lady behind the claims that she was going to turn him in, claiming that he understood Spanish and that there was a look in her eye and that she was trying to be greedy. It was a loose end that they couldn't afford to leave untied.
Easy, Dutch. What was that?
Horrible old crone.
But you killed her.
She was gonna betray us, Arthur. Couldn't you tell?
No.
Well, I got some Spanish. She was.
You keep killing folk, Dutch.
For the first time, Dutch has ever directly been called out by Arthur on senselessly killing a person. You can see the anger and frustration written all over Dutch's face. A man who has carefully crafted a persona of being someone for the people's greater good. The once sensible man in this life of living wild and free, yet still adhering to moral codes separating them from the rest of the angry, savage outlaws that roam these lands, was now starting to look just like the rest of them. While many people have voiced their willingness to have the game completely omit the chapter of Guarma, I myself at some point in time was one of them. I felt Guarma shifted too far away from the rest of the Vanderlyn gang, and while in some ways it's beneficial in the grand scheme of things, Rockstar expanded the world of Red Dead Redemption by showing a tropical island ravaged by slavery and abused by civilized men trying to make a fortune, really making the world a real place and not just settled in the West. The island is beautiful, and breathtaking. Yet I'd rather it focus more on the events of the Vanderlyn gang as a whole, and not just the isolating few. Instead of Guarma being the next stage in the escape from the failed robbery of the Saint Denis Bank, perhaps they could have retreated further north into Annisburg, or completely shift far west into the open wilderness just north of Strawberry. We could have seen members such as Sadie, Charles, the women that aren't given that much screen time, such as Miss Grimshaw, Tilly, or Karen, have a much more direct role in the gang, taking up arms, perhaps giving a much better idea how the entire gang takes up arms in hopes of saving each other and escaping the death grips of the law. Even a better idea of how they all escaped the Blackwater Massacre, leading to the events of Coulter back in the beginning of the game. Either way, there's no doubt a lot of blood would have been shed, and maybe more Vanderlyn members would have met a swifter end, catching a bullet from a Pinkerton agent. Maybe Rockstar felt the gang and ultimately the player needed more time to breathe, considering Hosea and Lenny were just killed. Two characters very near and dear to Arthur himself. But whatever the reason, Guarma's a chapter that ultimately needs to happen. And let me explain why. Arthur sees firsthand Dutch's deteriorating mental state. Undoubtedly hungry, angry from the death of Hosea and all his money being lost with the sinking ship. There's no doubt Dutch is questioning all the time, energy, and fellow members being sacrificed, all for what? To be enslaved on a sugar plantation or robbed by a lonely old tour guide? I can't entirely say if this is the chapter where Dutch is really starting to kill out of the thrill of it, but what is apparent is the curtain is lifted here. The stress of the unknown, with no certainty on how they're going to be getting off the island, if ever, on top of the low odds of making it back to the rest of the gang, always heavy on their shoulders. Arthur's not quite aware of his sickness and the severity of it yet, but I believe it's with the added stress, the starvation, dehydration, and just the amount of struggle his body's put through that precipitates his sickness. If you pay close attention while at Shady Belle, Arthur's cough slowly creeps up here and there in a few selective cutscenes, and he also makes a note of feeling sick, blaming it on the swamp in a journal entry of his. But it's not until when Arthur and Dutch return from Guarma that they're both visibly changed. Arthur looks more physically exhausted, his color has become much paler, with a heavy reddish bags drawing all the attention away from his eyes. His sickness finally manifested in his looks. It's almost as if his body's never recovered from Guarma. When he should have been resting and taking it easy, he's fighting a war that has nothing to do with him. And while fighting this war, he's dealing with hunger, thirst, and grief for watching his own father, Hosea, and younger brother Lenny get murdered in cold blood, all while he just watched. Dutch, on the other hand, appears to be focused from his return from Guarma. Not so much on the gang as he once was, but more on his own personal ambition and getting the rest of the gang members to rally behind him. While it may be easy to say, his urgency and pleas to have everyone rally behind him can be seen as a result of returning to the bleak situation the gang's predicament in light of the co-founder Hosea being deceased and the gang in a completely different area, leaving behind everything yet again in hopes of the Pinkertons being thrown off their trail, only to be worsened by Agent Milton tracking them down thanks to some negligence on Bill's part. There's a lot rapidly going on that pulls the player's attention away, making it easy to miss the one major thing: Dutch's slip from reality. A slip that I believe is first blatantly exhibited in this interaction here.
Working it all out. Once and for all, Arthur.
What now?
We're back, and I'm sitting here, and I am contemplating the great journey of the sun and considering a famous chess move. Those oily enactors of a mediocre justice, the Pinkertons, and their benefactor, the depressing millionaire Leviticus Cornwall, they want us, Arthur. They want us. And they are going to have us.
Maybe they ain't the problem.
Meaning?
I don't know. It's just, well, I can't help but feel we would have been better running off someplace else.
But the game ain't over, Arthur. I mean, I ain't played my final move, but
I guess I'm more interested in saving lives than winning at chess.
and maybe life ain't such a thing to cling on to so tightly.
No doubt. What about the women?
You sound like Hosea. I miss him.
I asked you a question.
What do you think?
We can't stay here. That much is obvious. Where are we gonna run to? I mean, they chased us from the west. They chased us over the mountains. They ran us into the sea.
Arthur, do you have my back?
Always, Dutch. But there's more than your back to worry about. We need more money. We've been on the run for months now, and I seen you killing folk in cold blood like you always told me not to. And I'm sorry, but I can't help but think that if we
There is country in Roanoke Ridge past Butcher Creek I believe we could hold.
Okay.
You and Charles, you could take folks up that way.
Micah and I need to do some reconnaissance. I ain't got a final plan yet. Arthur, I ain't got it. I just need time I need time and no traitors.
Arthur catches Dutch contemplating on the current situation, angrily claiming the Pinkertons and Leviticus Cornwall want them. He talks of a glorious final chess move. Arthur then rebuttals, claiming it's better to count their losses, think of the women, and just move on. Dutch is visibly upset by this and likens Arthur's sentiment to Hosea. Then he dismisses Arthur, who for the second time directly calls Dutch out and killing in cold blood. Dutch wants nothing more of the truth and ends it by sending Arthur and Charles to clear out some land, claiming they can hold out there. Arthur and Charles are sent away, while Dutch says he and Micah are going to be conducting reconnaissance. Dutch, this entire conversation echoes the mindset of Micah, angry, selfish, vengeful. In hindsight, it appears Dutch purposely sent Arthur and Charles away so he and Micah can work on the quote-unquote future together, with both of them feeding into the greedy, vengeful mentality that the both of them have adopted. Now it's clear as to why he sent Arthur away. Clearly, he was one of the few people that was blatantly calling Dutch out on his wrongdoings, but also it's important to note that besides Dutch, Arthur is the next figure to have the greatest amount of respect among all the Vanderlyn members, with Arthur having any kind of opposition towards Dutch in his decision making, or calling out Dutch for adopting a mentality similar to Micah, or Micah poisoning the mind of Dutch. This would undoubtedly cause a civil war among the gang, with many of the members being split, and Arthur not quite yet sick, so the sentiment towards him has not yet changed. He still has a very high level of respect from many of the gang members. So with him saying that Dutch is killing in cold blood, he's exhibiting the mentality of Micah, who is very well known to be argumentative and hot-headed and have an affinity for shooting first, not even caring of asking questions at all. The gang would have definitely fallen apart. Now, as far as Charles goes, with the exception of Arthur, I believe Charles would be the next person to hold any type of resistance. I think he was also set because he would keep Arthur in check. Charles has a lot of respect in Arthur's eyes, and Charles exhibits a similar mentality to that of Arthur, really taking Dutch's earlier motto and philosophy of looking out for other people and not killing in cold blood and only fighting when you absolutely have to heart. And we see that with Charles during the later events of Beaver Hollow, when he becomes an unofficial ambassador between the Vanderlyn gang and the Native Americans. While not as aggressive or being at the forefront as, say, Arthur was, Charles definitely sits in the back and tries to mitigate as much influence that Dutch clearly has over the younger generation of the Native Americans that are hot-headed, temperamental, and eager to take back what they believe was theirs. So it would make sense for Dutch to get rid of the two figures that would cause any type of resistance. But as I was saying, guarma's very important because it puts Arthur, his body, his mentality, and his moral compass to the absolute test. He comes back sick, completely ravaged. I think his clock was ultimately cut in half because of all the stress and everything his body had to endure. Instead of resting and relaxing, he was hitting the fast forward button on reaching his deathbed. Dutch, on the other hand, I don't think seeing the worth in trying to keep the veil that he always had and trying to preach the moral compass that he always claimed to have. Throughout the entirety of the game, you can see him and Micah slowly get closer, even before the events of the game, hearing about how much influence Micah had over Dutch and convincing him to even launch the ferry job, which led to the Blackwater Massacre. It would make even more sense, obviously, that behind the scenes during the Guarma chapter, him and Dutch are talking more of the future. On the boat ride back to Lemoyne from Guarma, you can see Dutch still have a little bit of that earlier sentiment, but it was almost like as soon as he got hit by Milton on his return from Guarma, on top of seeing the state that everyone is living in without him, it was almost like Dutch was pushed to the absolute brink. I think if there was never a Guarma chapter, to oversimplify the way Rockstar could have went, they could have went one of three ways. One of it was, instead of having Guarma, they could have had any other instance, whether long or a short period of time, that would have put Arthur's body through the same ordeal to precipitate ultimately his death. I think that'd be the best way if they wanted to continue with having Arthur die on screen. The next one would be, instead of having Arthur die in this game at all, is to completely omit Guarma, and assuming they keep the same ending where Dutch sticks with Micah and John escapes or goes his own way, so to speak, they could add it where Arthur went along with John, essentially protecting Abigail and Jack as being their protector or guardian of some sorts, not exactly living with them, but keeping a very close eye on them. Or they could have had it where Arthur completely went his opposite way and stuck to himself. That wouldn't have been too foreign, considering we see Sadie and Charles do the same thing. Sadie becomes a bounty hunter at the end of the game. Charles is basically doing side hustles in Saint Denis. Or a more interesting take would have been initiating that civil war among the Vanderlyn gang, so to speak, where where Arthur, not quite yet on his deathbed as we see once he returns from Guarma, puts his foot down, or maybe even doesn't put his foot down. Instead, he decides to confront Micah or confront Dutch and take matters into his own hands and stop the downward spiral a little prematurely. I think that would have been a little interesting because that would have completely altered the subsequent chapters, primarily Beaver Hollow, where we see Arthur, Sadie, John, and Charles all kind of get a little bit closer, where they start distancing themselves a little bit from Dutch. So completely omitting that chapter, everyone's alliances or positions within the gang would have been completely different. But I'm gonna pass the question on to you. Primarily, do you agree with me? Do you think that that was the main importance or significance of Guarma? If not, what's your position on Guarma? What do you think its main purpose was, if any? And do you think if there wasn't a Guarma, Arthur would have survived to at least the entirety of the game, where there wouldn't have been an epilogue where we played as John? I want to hear from you.
I'm dying, sister.
Okay.
Yeah, I got TB. I got it. Beating a man to death for a few bucks.
What if Arthur never got sick? I think this is one of the more interesting questions to pose when it comes to the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 and how the gang ultimately fell apart. There is no greater fall from grace as that between Arthur and Dutch, or even Arthur's position in the entire gang. From the very beginning, we can see the power and respect his presence alone commands. Sadly, by the time the chapter of Beaver Hollow rolls around, his body's exhausted. The sickness that plagues him now has a name, and it even has a face. It can be seen particularly in Arthur's face, with his skin pale, eyes bloodshot, and the bags around his eyes carrying the weight of death around the corner. The gang, particularly Micah and even to some degree Dutch, start to make fun of his failing health and his inability to be considered of any real use.
Well, Arthur needs to rest. I will.
Personally, I think the chapter of Beaver Hollow holds a lot of sadness. Arthur's aggression, the support he once had from the gang, and the support he had from his father is no longer there. He gets sidestepped and continuously is questioned in his physical capabilities and where his loyalty truly lies. Well, it's obvious during the chapter of Beaver Hollow, Micah has practically been his replacement as Dutch's trusted assistant. You can't help but wonder if this was always destined to be, or if this was really a result of Dutch viewing Arthur as being sick, and because of his sickness, he's considered delusional, weak, and too afraid to do what has to be done, whether if that necessity is true or not. Now let's first go back and ask ourselves if this would ever happen if Arthur didn't get sick. What would Arthur's position in the gang have been had he never gotten sick, or had such a shaky position in the gang towards the end of the game? Would the gang have fallen apart the way that it did? Would Arthur still have been replaced by Micah? There's still a few ways that we can actually tackle this concept, but I want to start this off with the relationship between Micah and Arthur. All throughout the chapter of 1 and 2, during the events of Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, there are moments where the two of them collide.
Hello, old friend. Had a good time, did you?
You going to get me out of here?
I ain't decided yet.
Real funny.
Oh, I ain't joking, cowpoke. I heard so much bluster out of your mouth these last 6 months. And now, I got an opportunity to watch you be silenced.
Well, you gotta do something.
Why?
I always looked up to you, Arthur.
Well, that's your first mistake.
It's quite clear that Rockstar made their clashes to show us the opposing mentalities the two of them have. Where Arthur can be cold-blooded, hot-headed, and not think twice about killing people, he still refuses to kill innocent people. He upholds the teaching of Dutch and refuses to kill or rob out of anything other than pure necessity. Mike, on the other hand, purely serves just himself, quick to end anyone that disrespects him. He even tries his best to convince Dutch and the rest of the gang to, at the very least, acknowledge the weaker members for not holding their own and carrying their own weight. From Micah's point of view, it's not fair that he and the rest of them are doing all this hard work and the women and children aren't doing anything at all, so it's just best to cut them loose. It goes without saying Micah and Arthur have two very different mentalities, but if we're going to be looking at this theory through the relationship of Arthur, Micah, and Dutch and their standing in the gang, let's first assume everything else happens as it does in the gang, with the exception of Arthur getting sick. The chapter of Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook shows Micah in a very submissive position to Arthur. He may hold the selfish bloodlust temper already expressed he has, yet he takes great care in neither offending Arthur nor blatantly causing any kind of wedge between him and Dutch. It may be possible that while not afraid or intimidated by Arthur, Micah's fully aware of Arthur's closeness to Dutch and Dutch's reliance on him. He could also be aware of Dutch's reliance on Hosea's judgment, a judgment that I think is safe to say is not in Micah's favor at all, with Hosea and Arthur both blaming the events of the failed Blackwater heist on Micah, getting in Dutch's ear, and undermining Arthur and Hosea's safer venture. Now, if you go back and revisit the first 2 chapters, it's interesting to see that during Horseshoe Overlook and even Clement's Point, Micah's not really that involved in too many missions. In chapter 2, he's saved by Arthur during the Blessed Are the Meek mission, where he's in the jail of Strawberry ready to be hanged for starting a fight that results in the death of 2 men. It's here where we also get to see more of the dynamic between Micah and Arthur. Yet what's worth really noting is how the mission ends. Micah leaves Arthur and shares he's not going back to camp without a peace offering to Dutch. He intentionally avoids Strawberry in light of shooting up the town with Arthur, yet he stays out in the wilderness keeping a close eye on a potential score he can lift off the O'Driscolls. While it's evident to some degree that Dutch clearly likes Micah and is looking out for him, this is obvious by Dutch sending Arthur to go save his ass for Strawberry. It makes the move of Micah having to acquire some type of peace offering from Dutch almost redundant, completely unnecessary. But it's important because it provides some insight to how Micah and Dutch really get along. As I said before, during the chapter of Coulter, Micah expresses his reluctance to look out for weaker gang members. Clement's Point and Horseshoe Overlook, to a lesser degree, almost entirely revolves around the gang's members and their attempts at consolidating the position they believe was an advantage between the Braithwaites and the Greys. During the chapter of Clement's Point, Micah only has 2 appearances. The first is during Blessed Are the Peacemakers, where he attempts to broker a truce between Colm and Dutch. Arthur's capture was a real goal of this brokered peace, and taking into account Micah's own dislike of Arthur, I always considered this to be a setup by Micah and Colm. Perhaps we'll talk about that more in a later video, but besides this false olive branch offering, the only other mission we see Micah in during Clement's Point is a short walk in a pretty town, a mission that results in Bill, Micah, and Arthur damn near slaughtering every resident after the assassination of Sean. The reason why I bring this up is because Micah's strangely absent during this entire chapter. Something I find incredibly odd for a man that does nothing but appease Dutch any chance he gets. You would think he'd be pretty abundant here. And this leads me to believe he isn't absent at all from this chapter, at least not absent from Dutch's perspective. If we use the events of Strawberry and Micah's own mentality of reluctantly helping the rest of the gang, it would make sense then that Micah went about his own dealings during the chapter of Clement's Point, moving from town to town, leaving behind a trail of chaos and bloodshed that he was fully aware would put him more and more in a bad light, giving more ammunition to Hosea, Arthur, and anyone else who particularly doesn't like him or his way of handling things. It's also a blatant lack of respect for Dutch's teachings. It would make sense to believe that Micah went about his own business pretending he was onto some financial leads or some type of gain to benefit Dutch and the gang at large, when in reality, he was doing whatever the hell he wanted, and whenever anything got out of hand, there was too much blood being shed, or he attracted too much of attention, he would acquire some type of peace offering and come secretly to Dutch. It would then make sense to believe Micah would explode in a fit of rage and, fully aware of the outcome from his outbursts, would only return to Dutch with something of value, hiding it behind the claim of him doing it in the name of the gang. Something Dutch undoubtedly still held a very high priority over. Whether that was a genuine concern or if he did it all for show, I think is another matter. But the events of the first 2 chapters show Micah practically missing from the main events of the game, and these 2 chapters don't really have that much to do with Arthur's failing health, so I would go ahead and assume that everything plays out the way that it does in game. We'll go ahead and continue to say Sean dies, Kieran dies, Jack gets kidnapped by Angelo Bronte, and the gang moves from Clement Point to Shady Belle. Once at Shady Belle, Micah yet again is found to be missing from the main events, with the exception of him being present during the robbery of the Saint Denis Bank and a small robbery of a stagecoach on the side where he enlists the help of Arthur and Bill. His lack of tangible work suggests he was again off doing his own thing, yet there's one other person I want to mention here. A person who, depending on whether if he lived or not, would have undoubtedly changed the course of events and how the gang entirely handled a lot of different events, and that person is Hosea. I said earlier, in order for Micah and Dutch to get close, both Hosea and Arthur needed to be taken care of. In the later events of Beaver Hollow, Dutch is hardened and slowly isolates himself in light of Hosea's passing, and what he perceives to be the rest of the gang members distancing themselves from him, a perception undoubtedly fed into by Micah. While it may be difficult to really judge how everything would have went down during the later events of the game, if Hosea had lived through all the way until Beaver Hollow, the rift between the members would have been something closer resembling that of a civil war, rather than John and Arthur being turned on and treated as traitors or outcasts. Based on the opposing mentalities and shifting priorities between Dutch and Hosea, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to see Hosea to take up the role of holding the gang together the way we see Arthur do, which then would have allowed Arthur to not have his attention pulled in so many different directions and give him the space and time to be able to focus on one glaring issue at a time, with the guidance and support of Hosea. A guidance and strong support system he severely lacked towards the end of the game with Hosea's death. Now, I'll go into further detail in a later video as to how his death could very well have been something orchestrated by Micah, but for now, Again, assuming that he did die. The Saint Denis bank robbery as well as the events of Guarma did happen, everything would have taken its toll on Dutch's slipping mentality as it clearly does within the game. I believe we would still see him kill in cold blood and mask it behind necessity to protect themselves and to stay ahead of the law, a mentality similar obviously to Micah's. Sadly though, I believe the rift between Dutch and Arthur is inevitable, should everything play out the way that it does, regardless if Arthur is sick or not. I believe based off Dutch's own actions and how different and boldly Micah acts from the beginning of the game to the end, Dutch wouldn't change on his own. Everything he does and says would continue the way it does. Whether if Arthur does become sick or not, I think isn't all that important. What is important is how we see Micah act. Because it's fairly apparent both Micah and Dutch start having volatile mental states that bounce and grow off of each other. So far as Micah's continually to boldly place that wedge between Dutch and Arthur, arguably with Arthur being the only one who can actually get through to Dutch besides Micah now, none of the events will really change. Let's consider the events of Beaver Hollow for a moment. Micah starts to openly insult Arthur, calling him black lung and mocking his ability to be considered any kind of use. Dutch, on the other hand, invalidates Arthur's voice of reason and logic behind the argument that he's sick and doesn't know what he's saying.
1 score and 1 whole hell of a lot of noise.
We ain't so good at doing scores anymore, Dutch.
Are you feeling all right, Arthur?
Mike, on the other hand, instead of using Arthur's sickness as a means to invalidate his reason, uses it more as a moral advantage, to prove once and for all that he is the favorable son, that he is quote-unquote better man. Micah throws around how he and Dutch have to set plans for the gang to move on, completely implying he and Dutch are now the only ones really caring and looking out for the gang. The only time Arthur really puts up any type of a fight or really gets angry at Micah for his lack of respect, he then succumbs to a coughing fit. If Micah truly was ever intimidated by Arthur, or he held resentment at the status and respect Arthur commanded during the early chapters of the game from the entire gang, a level of respect he would never have and so compensated by sucking up to Dutch, now, with Arthur sick, his resentment was starting to show. Perhaps in the early stages of the game, he knew physically he could never take Arthur on in a fair fight, nor could he challenge the position that Arthur held between Dutch, Hosea, and the rest of the gang members. But now that he's sick, Hosea is dead, and Dutch paranoid, the table is turned. Arthur's physical health was rapidly deteriorating, and the family he loved so dearly started to fall apart. Now was the time for Micah to not only replace Arthur, but mock him for the position he was now in. If Arthur never got sick, I believe his position mentally would have definitely been different. Because of his sickness, he was much more passive and frankly remorseful of the life he led and the path that led everyone else down. If it wasn't for this sickness, if it wasn't for this borrowed time that he felt like he was living on, I believe he would have had the same exact mentality and the same exact way of handling situations during the events of Beaver Hollow, the same way he handled them during the events of Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, by brute forcing his way through it. I think if he was well aware of Dutch's deteriorating mental state and how Micah was leading them all down a path to basically hell, there's no doubt in my mind that Arthur would have took up the advantage, completely dealt with Micah in his own way, possibly resulting in isolating and alienating Dutch even further. Regardless of what might have or may not have happened, one thing is certain, Micah held a position in Dutch's good graces, and that made it dangerous and frankly impossible for the gang to continue living harmoniously as a family, as Dutch, with the help of Hosea, was able to let it be for so many years.
We are gonna need a lot of it. And Mike, we need to talk. Figure out some things.
Of course, boss.
Figure out what?
The plan. Getting out of here.
Nothing's changed.
It hasn't, huh?
There's an old house west of Van Horn. Meet me there when you can, Black Lung.
Let's split up. We'll meet up back at camp.
Yeah. This is crazy.
I want to wrap this video up with asking, what do you think would have happened if Arthur had not have gotten sick? How do you think events would have transpired? Do you think anything would have been different in your own words? Do you agree with my position or do you beg to differ? I'd love to hear what you think down in the comment section below. In the meantime, if you have any recommendations, theories, or a particular topic you want to have discussed in a future video, please share them down in the comment section below. But until next time, thank you so much for watching.
What are we doing here, Colm? Is this thing over?
Was there ever a real possibility of a long-lasting truce taking place between Colm and the Vanderlyn gang? Or was this event the brainchild of both Colm and Micah? Colm clearly had the law on his tail, with his men causing much more problems for the local town they camped next to. His men can be found beating people and setting up traps on the countryside with little accountability or any type of rule enforcement on Colm's part, or this all could have been encouraged by him. Either way, Colm without any doubt finds himself in somewhat the same position as Dutch, possibly even being on Leviticus Cornwall's hit list with his name right next to his older brother in arms. I doubt the train the Van der Linde gang stole from them in the opening chapter of Coulter was their only planned robbery that was fully intended to be carried out. I'm sure there were many more other hits on Cornwall's property, fueling Cornwall's rage and boosting the wave of funding he supplied to the Pinkertons. Micah, on the other hand, there's no secret his relationship with Arthur is fragile at best, fighting to be Dutch's #1 adopted son and command the most respect in the Van der Linde gang, next to Dutch of course. Arthur's nothing more than an obstacle to what Micah wants most. Now, with Colm in his presence, it's time for the two of them to get what they want, and that's with Colm getting the law off his tail to buy a little time so he can disappear, or at the very least be considered less of a priority in the law's eyes. Micah, on the other hand, wanted to no longer be challenged, with full reign over Dutch and tailoring everything Dutch heard to ensure Micah got what he wanted with Dutch's unwavering support. Unwavering support that can only be achieved with Arthur gone, and if whatever they were after was retold in a way that at least sounded consistent with Dutch's teachings. Whatever the case, today I wanted to explore the events of the mission Blessed Are the Peacemakers. This mission takes place during Chapter 3 at Clement's Point. The Van der Linde gang finds themselves in the middle of using the Braithwaites and Gray's hatred against each other for their own personal gain, and a valiant effort to swoop the rumored Confederate gold out from under these families. The mission finds us right in the middle inside of the Van der Linde camp, with Micah proposing something that's actually very inconsistent with his character.
Colm O'Driscoll, have you lost your minds?
You're always telling us, Dutch, do what has to be done, but don't fight wars ain't worth fighting.
They want a parley? It's a trap.
Well, of course, it's probably a trap, but what do we got to lose finding out?
I always found this mission a little odd, and how Micah acts to be suspicious at best. Never mind the meetup with Colm was only handled with Micah, Dutch, and Arthur standing over watching in the distance, with no contingency plan made to involve any other gang members whatsoever should anything go wrong, but we'll dismiss this and chalk it up to Dutch swiftly making that decision on his own. Perhaps it was in a fit of agitation and doubt that he decided to involve as few people as possible that felt like a personal matter between two bitter enemies, completely disregarding all the bloodshed that did involve every gang's members over the years. But Mike is strangely optimistic about this. The man who, back in Strawberry, killed O'Driscolls in a drunken haze, or out of pure rage, or did it to just ingratiate himself more with Dutch for taking out members of his mortal enemy's gang. We'll never know the true reason behind all this, but it's hard to believe that the man who preaches cutting the weaker, lesser members loose from the gang and sees any kind of mercy as weakness is now begging Dutch to turn a blind eye and try to forgive a man for something he would never even consider doing. Micah, on the way to the meetup, even starts repeating the same sentiments Dutch always has.
I see all those mouths we gotta feed, and I dream too big, caring too much. That's my problem.
Caring too much? There's no such thing.
This is horse shit from both of you.
He says it all sarcastically, and is rightfully called out by Arthur. And we know through the events of the game, the entire Van der Linde gang believed this to be a trap Colm later confirmed to Arthur to be true, yet it wasn't the type of trap anyone expected. The trap here was to capture Arthur so Dutch and the rest of the Van der Linde gang would come to his rescue, only to be greeted by Pinkertons waiting for them. I've already established Micah and Colm's intentions and the mutual benefit of them orchestrating this trap together. However, there's one glaring issue here. It's not Micah that had originally presented the peace offering to Dutch, but Pearson. Pearson claims he followed some O'Driscolls into town, and it almost erupted into a fight until they started talking, and a possible peace was pitched. Unless these O'Driscoll members, for some odd reason, found it in the kindness of their hearts to not attack on sight, as they normally would if they were aware that this was a member of Dutch's gang they were dealing with, or maybe they took pity on Pearson or found him more amusing than threatening, and maybe they were smarter than the average O'Driscoll. It's really possible that there was a lot done within this actual interaction between Pearson and these O'Driscolls, or even through these members by chance hearing of Colm trying to plan something out, and these members, in an attempt to get in Colm's good graces, preemptively established this meeting through making contact with Pearson. While all of that is definitely possible, I think it's less likely, given how Mike is acting specifically. What I believe to be the case is, even this chance meetup between Pearson and the O'Driscolls was staged. In a previous video, I talked about how Micah is unaccounted for during most of the chapters of 2 and 3. In Chapter 3, the only time we really see Micah is during Blessed Are the Peacemakers and a short walk in a pretty town. Given how he acts in Chapter 2, doing so as he pleases, and when things go south, he returns to Dutch with some sort of peace offering or a gift to alleviate the wrongdoing he's done. I believe the meetup with Colm to be one of those instances, with an added benefit of complete completely removing Arthur. Perhaps he ran into a situation where he found himself at odds with O'Driscoll's and decided to broker some type of deal within Colm. Maybe they hunted him down, knowing that he was the one that enacted all the events at Strawberry, and they found him alone. Whatever the case, the law wants Colm, but they want Dutch even more. Dutch isn't an easy capture and undoubtedly won't leave the camp without any kind of decent level of protection. So even if he does leave camp and they manage to capture him, Arthur would easily be the head of a vengeful rescue contingent. So it's easier then to make Dutch come to us. Even if this was the case, I don't fully believe that Micah was willing to completely give up on Dutch and let that happen to him. If we look at the events of the end of Blessed Are the Peacemakers, when Arthur makes his way back into the Vanderland camp, there's almost no sort of action that's being taken by anybody within the camp. Even though Arthur himself said that if anything goes south or whenever this meeting ends, we will meet at the fork in the road. Micah and Dutch had to have known that Arthur obviously didn't make it. And we're not deep enough to the story to see any type of falling out between Dutch and Arthur, or see any reason for Dutch to give up on Arthur as he does in the later stages of the game. Besides, Hosea is still alive. I'd imagine Hosea and John would have definitely acknowledged that Arthur's been missing for a couple days and riled up the rest of the camp into trying to look for him. So I don't actually believe that Dutch willingly ignored this. I think if any concerns or any problems came up to his mind, either Micah completely put them at ease, or Dutch was so involved and agitated from the events of the meeting with Colm that he just couldn't be bothered or preoccupied with what happened to Arthur, not really thinking anything more of it, and perhaps, he'll just see them later at the camp. But either way, I've always believed that this is the way that's how the meeting went. I think Colm fully intended to capture Dutch, give him to the Pinkertons, so that way he can escape and get some of the heat off him. I really think the way that he planned on doing that was using Arthur as bait. However, I don't believe Micah would have ever allowed Dutch to get himself captured. I think Micah would have let it be until Dutch became aware of the situation, and I think at that point Micah would have either convinced him that it wasn't worth it, or again, because Hosea and John are alive, with them very much advocating to rescue Arthur, I believe that Micah would have put himself at the front of a rescue mission and would have done pretty much exactly what he did with John at the end of the game. During the We Are Best Selves mission, when John is on the train and he gets shot, Micah claims that there was nothing he can do, that John died. And I think that Micah would have done the exact same thing here with Arthur. I think he would have done the absolute bare minimum, absolutely no attempt, and just let whatever Colm wanted to do with them completely happen. But let me know what you think down in the comment section about this theory. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And also, if you have a suggestion for any theories, feel free to post that down in the comment section below. Always taking recommendations, suggestions, anything you want to see. But until the next video, you guys be safe.
I feel like you should take your woman and child and get lost.
Do you?
You could give something to Jack. It's that or... Well, I don't see no way out of this.
What about loyalty?
Be loyal to what matters.
What are you gonna do?
I'll be okay, but do it for me. It would make me feel good, if that makes any sense.
A little, but...
Listen to me. When the time comes, you gotta run and don't look back. This is over.
Many things have fallen to scrutiny and reevaluation after Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis was revealed to him. Arthur made many mistakes in his life, a life that he wasn't even entirely sure he spent doing what was right. No matter how much he believed in his cause towards the gang, towards Dutch, towards his family, a firm belief in something doesn't invalidate the questionable morality of your actions. Ethics that have been all too easy for him to cast aside. We may not know how exactly Arthur was in his youth or what his greatest misdeeds in the years before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 were, but we definitely get a good glimpse of how far he was all too willing to go. How Arthur treats the poor souls who have unwillingly agreed to Leopold Strauss's loan terms is a good indication. Thomas Downs and Mr. Roble, I think, are the biggest victims. Roble doesn't even speak English.
The Kaiserreich.
I don't speak German neither. I'm here for money. Money.
And presumably has little to nothing just based on his decision to accept money from Strauss. A contract with terms that are always in the most unfavorable conditions for the people who decide to take it. And we know they're so unfavorable because there's a couple different sources, one of which was Winston Holmes, who even told Strauss giving him money is a risk since he has no means of getting any money for himself, let alone paying the gang what he owes them.
Hey, you knew it was a risk.
I didn't know nothing. Your name is all I knew.
Well, the German-speaking fella then, Mr. Strauss, he knew my work situation was precarious, that this whole thing was a risky venture. Sir, I'm merely stating, a man without a job, with limited prospects, at those rates, repayment was by no means guaranteed. I said I'd do my best, and I did.
Gwen Hughes straight up resorts to grave robbing just to pay his debt once Arthur pays him a visit. Point is, Arthur, through just the various money-lending missions, proves time and again that he is Dutch's greatest enforcer. Strong, loyal gunman, with little room for sympathy or understanding for regular people. And if your name is in the gang's ledger, or is even on the bad side of his leader, Dutch van der Linde, there's no hope of a pass, no hope for forgiveness, no hope at mercy. That is, of course, until Arthur gets sick. Arthur's rapidly declining health, compounded with Dutch's continuous poor and reckless decision-making, along with the deep emotions tied to dwelling on the absence of Hosea, his other adopted father's life being lost, and the price of Sean, Lenny, and countless others being killed, all for nothing. Arthur's priorities were beginning to be replaced, and along with it, his mentality. Gone were the days of blind obedience to the gang, to Dutch and his vision of a dream for a world that was rapidly fading away. Now was the time to do as much good, and save as many people as he could before his time was gone. Arthur began to question Dutch's leadership, where the gang has currently found themselves in, and many situations leading up to the events of Beaver Hollow. Everything in Arthur's life became scrutinized and doubtful. Without Dutch's vision, without Dutch's blessing, without the comfort of at least having some kind of belief, Arthur had all the time in the world with no set death date. A death date that was given with the contraction of tuberculosis. Arthur began to question who he really was. What had he really stood for this entire time? What was truly for the gang, and what was really just Dutch being self-centered, focused on what he wanted, achieving his own will and using the members of the gang driven by the unanimous love for Dutch and the cause of living wild and free, with Dutch being the only one that can make that dream a reality. Arthur begins to have regrets and sympathy. This is apparent through in-game dialogue with strangers found in the world, characters in the main story, and even in Arthur's own personal journal. A vital piece of insight into the mind of our otherwise blockheaded protagonist. And just like his various actions throughout his life, his mentality and opposition towards those who were seen as nothing more than obstacles in his way, obstacles that wanted nothing but the worst for him, Dutch, and the overall gang's well-being. One such person who was placed inside this camp was Colm O'Driscoll, and possibly was even seen as the biggest supporter for the gang's downfall. Unfortunately, as far as direct one-to-one interactions between Colm and Arthur goes, there's really only one in the game, that being the time Arthur was captured by Colm's men, in an attempt to use Arthur as bait for the real prize, Dutch. Colm's plan was to capture Arthur, keep him prisoner inside his own camp, waiting for the moment Dutch realized what had happened to him, expecting Dutch to then understand the meetup was nothing more than a trap he walked into, giving Colm exactly what he wanted. Being played for a fool by Colm would undoubtedly be something Dutch would not take lightly. Something Colm was counting on. With Dutch and most likely Dutch's most wanted gunmen by his side on a rescue mission, the law would be waiting for all of them, giving Colm a pardon for his own crimes. Whether if it was as simple as being at the mercy of Colm, Arthur was strung up, had a gunshot wound to his shoulder, was completely disarmed, damn near stripped naked, and held in the center of a heavily armed camp after all, with no foreseeable chance to escape. Or maybe it was because Arthur decided to have a moment of clarity, grasping the concept long ago that the time of outlaws and lawless lands are long gone, and the feud between Colm and Dutch should just be dropped because they got bigger problems. Perhaps it could have been a mixture of the two. Either way, Arthur chose to reason with Colm instead, telling him even if he does decide to lead Dutch into a trap, handing his longtime rival over to the law would not excuse him in the long run, in their eyes. It may buy him some time, but they'll soon be out on his own tail.
Let me go, Colm, and end all this crap between you two. We all got real problems now.
The way I see it, they get him, they forget about me.
They ain't the forgetting sort.
It's a moment of reason. There's no emotional outburst from Arthur, no hate, no real mocking or attempt to rile up Colm. Arthur does play dumb about the killings at 6 Point Cabin, but he still doesn't argue or try to shove Dutch's philosophy down Colm's throat. There's almost no real animosity towards Colm either, and with this being the sole direct interaction between the two of them, it's hard to accurately say what Arthur's position towards Colm really is. And hear me out on that. The reason why this is even brought up is because Arthur dwells on his own position towards Colm. This is said directly from his own journal. The mission Goodbye Dear Friend is all about the execution of Colm and Saint Denis. Arthur, Dutch, and Sadie attend the execution to not only watch but ensure the execution is a success. This event is reflected on in Arthur's own journal. and the entire entry has some interesting things to talk about. It's an entry that really discusses more how Dutch reacted to Colm's death. Arthur says he's back to himself and he hopes that this helps calm Dutch's recent behavior. Hopefully it'll help bring him back to how he used to be, but at the very least, for the time being, he can be normal even for a little while. Arthur then continues by saying he, unlike Dutch, doesn't feel anything. He feels the same. The exact passage reads, "I guess I felt the same. You weren't ever exactly my fight, really, and now my fight is real different, with a different enemy. One I cannot see, nor put a bullet into. Him and his boys was our fault, alright, but did we ever exist, or were we just a group of individuals, each just falling for Dutch's dumb bluster? Feel like I don't know nothing no more. That whole life of certainty is over. My code that I lived and killed by, was it true? Or was there a bigger truth I was too dumb to ever see?" With just a small piece of his own deepest thoughts and the sole interaction between him and Colm to concretely go off of, it makes it appear Arthur never had any real issues with Colm himself. When you add in every moment Colm is brought up from Dutch's own mouth, Arthur tells him it's a fool's errand. Dutch told Arthur directly after all that revenge is a luxury we cannot afford, and Arthur never hesitates to let Dutch know revenge is what it looks like whenever he speaks of Colm.
And the last thing we need is to get bushwhacked by Colm O'Driscoll. Let's go.
I know you hate him, Dutch.
He's here for us.
I doubt that.
No, you're just doubting me.
I would never doubt you, Dutch. You always said revenge is a luxury we can't afford.
Through the game, Arthur shows a deep level of hate towards Colm's men, but he never talks down about Colm directly. Or you could say the hate that he shows towards his men is just an extension of what he is supposed to feel towards Colm as a man who is the bitter enemy of his leader and adopted father, or it could be just through actual run-ins with Colm's men out in the open world, and just slowly over time it solidifies the narrative that Dutch was putting in his own head about Colm. It's difficult to say considering the feud between the two of them has been going on for years, and we're really catching the entire thing towards the tail end of it. But I do want to remind everyone that most people naturally take the sides of those they love, those who they know and trust. Dutch definitely has, or at least had, Arthur's love and unwavering trust for a long period of time. Plus, he has the gratitude of everything Dutch taught him. How to live, how to have some kind of code to operate by to separate himself from the rest of the world's bloodthirsty outlaws. And Dutch, of course, taught Arthur how to read and write. No matter how questionable of a character Dutch had, or how true his intentions ever were, we can't just forget the unbelievable amount of patience, understanding, and compassion anyone would need to have to teach someone all of that. Especially taking the time on an unruly deviant as Arthur was described to be. Arthur isn't just siding with a loved one here, he's siding with someone who he owes everything to. A man who never steered him wrong. His journal passage just reveals Colm's death was one that didn't really satisfy him personally. Dutch was the one who was finally happy to see him gone. Revealing to Arthur the pointless feud may have always been one filtered heavily through Dutch's own hate, his own hurt, anger, his refusal to let go and move on. With Arthur wrapping up this entry with talking about his own personal battle with the sickness, struggling to come to grips with the severity of it, the fragility of his own mortality, and accepting he may have been led down the wrong path most of his life. I take this as just him reflecting on yet another major part of his life tied to Dutch's own vision. This feud, this hate towards Colm was never important. Or at least, if it ever was, it isn't now. How could it be? Even if Arthur had a personal vendetta against Colm, let's just say for capturing Arthur and having Arthur suffer a gunshot wound inflicted by Colm's men, it still was pointless. How could you celebrate in the death of a man that may be as horrible as the bandit Colm O'Driscoll when you know you will be soon following him to the grave? What kind of victory is that in such a short amount of time, especially when there's so much left to do, so much left to try to do right or set relationships straight that may have been fractured due to other things being incorrectly being a higher priority? Was Colm ever Arthur's fight? In some ways, yes, because it was Dutch's. It may only have been due to Arthur's diagnosis and failing health that helped him question the depths of his own personal opposition towards Colm, but sickness or not, there would never be a halfway with Colm. That is just a symptom of the circumstances they all find themselves in. Arthur loved and respected Dutch, valuing loyalty above everything else. The smallest parlay would be a betrayal. It may be a small one, but it's still one all the same. The best they could ever hope for is Arthur just leaving this life, moving on and dropping the rivalry altogether, letting the two of them sort it out amongst themselves. obviously that wasn't what happened, and that would only ever happen in the most wishful of circumstances. Something Dutch would probably have to let Arthur do, otherwise he would see it as Arthur just stabbing him in the back, and that may also be a thought Arthur probably can never live with. Besides the run-ins with Colm's poorly regulated gang and Dutch continuously reminding Arthur and everyone else how horrible of a person he is, Arthur appears to have no personal resentment towards Colm. Even if he did, Arthur's mentality towards the matter was already shifting as early as Horseshoe Overlook, long before his health got to the point of him coughing up blood uncontrollably or being visibly unwell. Arthur appeared to have understood the gang's way of life is already on the way out, and everyone on the wrong side of the law should really band together for protection or acquire enough money to just disappear.
Dutch says that we...
Dutch says a lot. That's his gift. Saying things.
Oh, yeah? What do you mean by that?
I was a prize pony once. Now I'm a workhorse. Listen, Dutch is... But, well, you was at that thing in Blackwater. We already seen Pinkertons here. New century's coming. This life, this way, well, we're the last, I reckon. And we ain't long for it.
And that's the way it goes, I guess.
For me, yes.
Later on in the game, it just becomes a trivial matter of how important Colm's demise really was. Arthur's mentality is way too preoccupied with other things. He does question how much of it was really his or the fight of others, but the real question we should ask ourselves is how much of it was personal? Or how big of a priority was the death or some type of justice equal to that of his crimes? Considering Arthur felt nothing in the end, I'd say it was a low one. A low one that unfortunately Arthur had to spend the rest of his life reflecting on how much of his time, how much of his resentment or any type of detest of anyone that rode with Colm was genuine, or how much of it was planted by Dutch, the man Arthur gave his entire life to. Like usual, I want to hear what you think down below. And I want to take this time to not only thank you for watching this video, and of course it's in entirety, do share your thoughts about it as well. Did you enjoy it? Anything I missed? What other topic would you love me to cover next? But I also want to take this time to not only wish all of you a Merry Christmas, celebrate it, but a Happy Holidays. And a giant thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching these recent videos. It really does mean a lot. But until next time, see you on the next video.
Why? You feel lucky?
Do you?
Oh, before me, at least 6 generations were born in chains. And for the last 3 years, I've been running from every lawman and bounty hunter west of the Lanahassee River. So yeah, I feel lucky. I'm the living embodiment of luck.
With the exception of John, I've consistently regarded Lenny as the individual who shared a sibling-like connection with Arthur. I believe Lenny played a crucial role in breaking Arthur out of his shell and revealing a side of Arthur that was hidden beneath the exterior. You see, initially within the opening hours of Red Dead Redemption 2's game, Arthur seemed like nothing more than a ruthless, cynical, and angry outlaw, hell-bent on carrying out whatever Dutch's orders were, regardless of what that meant for those that stood in his way. Arthur seemed, if not incapable, more than unwilling to be empathetic and understanding to those who found themselves in an unfavorable position towards the gang or even their leader's well-being. Yet that perception changed after a night of drinking with Lenny, aimed at helping Lenny unwind following a close call with Micah up in Strawberry, nearly getting captured and potentially hanged, as was going to be Micah's fate until Arthur stepped in at Dutch's behest. Lenny, along with Mary, serves as the key figures unveiling Arthur's more profound and compassionate facets in the earlier part of the game. This not only plays a pivotal role in Arthur's personal growth, but also significantly impacts the dynamic between Lenny and Arthur. As the storyline unfolds, Arthur consistently opts for Lenny in situations where other gang members, deemed more capable by many, could have been chosen. In Dutch's perspective, probably selecting Micah or even compromising with Arthur by choosing someone less troublesome, yet equally as proficient like Bill, John, or Javier. It's not to mistake Lenny's incapability of handling himself. He's just seen more as an experienced member, a young kid, more prone to sitting down and delving deep into the chapters of a book rather than jumping head-on into the more unsavory aspects of their life out on the run. Whether Arthur selected Lenny to join Dutch and himself in the Charlie Station heist, or relied on Lenny as a sole companion in the assault on Shady Belle, where they pilfered some high-quality bolt-action rifles from the Lemoyne Raiders, all stemmed from Arthur opting for a safer approach. He knew Lenny wouldn't stir up additional trouble and obviously could handle himself quite well. The choice to side with Lenny on these occasions could have also been influenced by Arthur's personal attachment to Lenny, or perhaps a combination of both factors. What remains certain is that Arthur had unwavering trust in this young kid and harbored a truly unique connection with him. Their bond deepened and became more prominent as the narrative unfolded. In the chapter of Shady Belle, and to some extent during Clement's Point, Lenny emerged as Arthur's alternative. Unlike John, there was no resentful and emotional history, Sean's incessant chatter, Micah and Sadie's volatile nature, or Charles' profound valor.
What's going on with you?
What do you mean?
You were just gonna send that woman and her children on their way?
We're wanted, man. We got Pinkertons breathing down our necks. We should be moving camp, not running off on some wild goose chase.
Lenny brought a no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point approach, and when guidance was needed, Lenny consistently turned to Arthur. His lack of experience and possibly even a drive to prove himself ensured there would be no mistakes. No irrational killing or moves done by Lenny without the approval of whom brought him along. A mentality that was undoubtedly desperately needed during the unfolding of the Vanderlyn gang towards the end of the game. It's interesting to think though, if you really look at it, Lenny's only the main focus of 2 missions. While he is in a handful of others to some degree, it is these 2 missions that leave a lasting impact. Not just on us as players, but possibly even Arthur. A Quiet Time has some real intimate moments between Arthur and Lenny, where Arthur actually opens up. Arthur even walks in on Lenny having sex with Lenny.
Lenny? Hey!
If that's not a real familial bond, I don't know what is. The other mission would be preaching forgiveness as he went, where the 2 of them launched their assault on the Lemoyne Raiders based out in the old, abandoned mansion that is Shady Belle. Where the former solidified an emotional connection between the 2, the latter showed Arthur how useful and reliable Lenny could be if just given a chance. Without a doubt convincing Arthur as the game progressed that Lenny could be and should be trusted a lot more, which makes Lenny's death all the more tragic. A while back I made a video expressing how symbolic the death of Sean was. The timing of his death and how brutal it was were crucial elements in a few ways. Sean received a gunshot wound to the head, immediately killing him during an ambush by what the Vanderlyn gang considered to be a bunch of inbred hillbilly southerners. They were dumb, and from the gang's perspective, easily fooled. Sean was killed at the height of the gang's revitalized efforts of finding some new suckers. The gang got cocky, they pushed their luck, and they were repaid with the life of one of their members. Arthur contributes a full page in his journal to Sean, citing him as an annoying little brother, a death that was shocking and had to have hit him hard, especially after seeing Sean's brains blown clean out of his head. Lenny, by contrast, and even Hosea, isn't given as much of a dedicated section as does Sean in Arthur's journal. Hosea is a special case though. I don't see any character with the exception of Dutch and maybe John holding such a special place in Arthur's eyes. Hosea is a vital father figure in Arthur's life, being a key figure in his adolescent years and even admitting to loving him more than Dutch. So I don't want to mistake his lack of adequate representation in terms of his death or how it emotionally impacted Arthur as Hosea being inconsequential, because that couldn't be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, the death of Hosea is often referred to as the most impactful across all characters, not just exclusively Arthur. It's just unfortunate that Hosea had to die in the exact same mission as Lenny. Lenny's often overshadowed not just by Hosea being killed, but the events of the actual game. One could argue that if Sean's death was a brutal punch in the gut to remind the gang to not get cocky, they are equally as vulnerable and can be played for a bunch of fools just like anybody else, Lenny's death destroyed any hope of any sort of positive outcome. A chance, as small as it might have been, to achieve a youthful revival of the Vanderlyn gang. Or even a smaller, more positive outlook between just Arthur and Lenny. One that wasn't tainted by the years of stress, hardship, and overall life experience that has long made its mark on the other gang members. Lenny's death is also surrounded by a fury of events that doesn't give Arthur enough time to properly process. A level of grief, and possibly even strong regret. The outcry Arthur has, with a noticeable voice crack of Lenny being shot, is unmistakable.
We can get across here! No!
Lenny, he's dead.
Oh, God, no!
Sadness that had to have been accompanied by a silent yet overbearing level of remorse for this young kid. A kid who still possibly had a chance to make it out of this life. Or even if that wasn't for him, Lenny never had a chance to properly live and experience love for himself. The type of love Arthur had hoped for with Mary. Yes, he might have been denied it, no matter how painful it was for him, At least it was an opportunity that Lenny never had, a kid that in the end Arthur wasn't able to fully protect. While it may be possible due to almost drowning at sea, getting stranded on the island of Guarma, then having to fight a revolutionary war, and realizing how sick he was immediately when he got back from Guarma, only to then push his own emotions and realization of his own mortality aside to focus on rescuing John from being hanged, all on top of the instability Dutch is starting to exhibit. Thinking of Hosea and Lenny, the fact both of them lost their lives and Arthur soon joining them, and how pretty much all three of their deaths would ultimately be for nothing, possibly could only be a thought that crept in here and there. Every time Dutch got irrational or did something Arthur didn't agree with, it'd bring back the thought of Hosea, pushing Lenny more and more to the wayside, or perhaps Lenny was just such a damn shame. It was a death Arthur didn't ever really want to properly face. Arthur basically became Lenny's mentor, assuming a role that kept both of them balanced in some way. On one hand, Lenny was taught what it meant to be an outlaw that upheld the teachings of Dutch, teachings Arthur learned firsthand from him growing up, ensuring Lenny was both self-sufficient in this harsh life they lived, and that he did it in a way that didn't mark him as a brutal savage like the rest of the outlaws that roamed the West. Arthur, on the other hand, had loyalty, obedience, someone that was level-headed and youthfully optimistic. How deeply Lenny's death affected him, or how events would have transpired differently had Lenny lived to see the events of Beaver Hollow, or even landed himself stranded on the island of Guarma with the rest of them, unfortunately would only be left open to speculation. However, I think something that can't be argued is that Lenny's death definitely impacted Arthur very severely. He didn't get the opportunity to stand over his lifeless body and say goodbye as he did with Sean. He didn't have those abundant memories that he did with Hosea. As a matter of fact, in the short amount of time that he did have with Lenny, it seemed like the perspective that he had for him changed so drastically. Even in the first mission, when they were stuck in Coulter and Pearson asked Arthur to go out into the mountains hunting, saying that he sent Bill and Lenny before but they didn't capture anything. Arthur directly says that Lenny's more into book reading.
I sent Lenny and Bill hunting and they found nothing.
Well, Lenny's more into book learning than hunting. Bill's a fool. Unless those mountains are full of game that want to read, ain't no wonder they found enough of this.
Well, they could have been a specific jab at just hunting. That might have been the overall perception. Even when it came to robbing, Lenny was better on the defensive. Better to keep him behind and protect the women and children. Yet where they were stuck at Shady Belle, it seemed like Arthur would rather have nobody else by his side. I always wished there was more said in Arthur's journal when it came to Lenny's death. I always wished it was a little bit more scripted and there was more of a cutscene similar to what we had with Sean and Hosea. But maybe it's all for the better. Maybe it's all meant for emotional interpretation. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Like always, if you have any suggestions on any characters to do next or anything in general, please feel free to share that down in the comment section below. But like always, thank you so much for watching.
So, that was a quiet drink?
First one was pretty quiet.
Yeah, the first one was pretty quiet.
Jimmy Brooks. I will remember that. I've got a good memory. I kill people. And maybe I should have killed you. Should I have killed you, Jimmy Brooks?
Arthur Morgan is the greatest protagonist I have ever seen in a video game. Never have I been so invested in the transformation of a character in any form of entertainment before. Arthur's funny, sarcastic, he had a love interest and even a small family once upon a time. He's a highly respected and very well-feared gunman in the ranks of the Vanderlyn gang. We love Arthur. We feel his pain, his annoyance, his anger, and even his sadness. I do have a massive character analysis of him coming up, and it was while preparing for that video that I wanted to explore the opposing view of Arthur. We all love him, and most, if not many of us, believe Dutch and Micah are much worse than anything Arthur could ever be. Dutch is killed time and again, steadily growing bolder with each instance, clearly becoming more and more reckless, all too willing to leave behind John and even Arthur in order to save his own skin. While Micah, on the other hand, seems to have never considered the moral ramifications of ending a life. The two of them may be equally worthy of being called horrible men that only care about themselves, using the well-being, or in Dutch's case, love and trust of others to push his will and vision of a free world further. But after reviewing some of the comments on my last video discussing when Dutch betrayed Arthur, I noticed quite a few people stated it was the other way around. It was in fact Arthur who had betrayed Dutch. The story of Red Dead Redemption 2 and that of Arthur's character arc is entirely told through the eyes of Arthur. giving us a view of the other members, the story's events, and even Arthur himself, a very biased approach. Arthur's done horrible things throughout his life, both on and off camera. One of the most savage instances was him beating an already terminally ill Thomas Downs on a debt he owes the gang. A debt that's met with a level of brutality by Arthur who almost looks like he takes the debt personally. He even goes so far as to suggest to Downs to sell his wife and property in order to repay the gang's debt.
Where's our money?
I don't have it.
Sell your place.
We already owe more than it's worth.
Then sell your wife, or your family, or something. We ain't your idea of charity. Is that clear?
Thomas!
When he returns later, immediately after robbing the bank of Valentine with the saddlebag stuffed with cash he just made off with, he makes no reservations about sparing the Downs family of the dead, or even their feelings at the loss of the beloved father and husband. He even crosses the boundary further by saying he hopes the hell he finds himself in is hot and terrible, otherwise he'd feel lied to. After saying that, he follows it up with threatening Thomas's son to correct the stare, or he'll soon be reunited with his father.
Either you got a lazy eye or lack of respect. Which is it, boy?
I ain't got no lazy eye. No respect for the likes of you.
Well, maybe when your mother's finished mourning your father, I'll keep her in black, on your behalf. You think on that, boy?
Arthur himself holds no delusions of being a bad man who has done horrible things. In the later chapters of the game, when he starts to make more conscious efforts to be kinder, more forgiving, and helpful of others, he denies having a pure heart of being a kind man. He hides his face in the shame of being identified as something other than what he sees himself as. It's a very difficult thing to convince someone out of their own self-image, perhaps even impossible for a man facing death's door such as Arthur is. He knows these small gestures, so minuscule in size compared to all the actions throughout the rest of his life, they cannot even be counted towards scrubbing away his sins or other transgressions. Yet, we as players can't help but feel bad for him. How many of us felt anger or sadness during the events of Beaver Hollow? Arthur's degree of respect and the ruthlessness that accompanied it in the early hours of the game are long gone. The feeling of trying to save the gang and provide for the other members is swiftly and very sneakily replaced with the feeling of anxiety and sadness for this, in Milton's own words, degenerate murderer. If it wasn't for Arthur's decline in respect or how he was treated by the other members, would we still feel sorry for him? We can look at the evolution of Arthur in two ways. On one hand, he, and I think most people blame his actions on blind loyalty. Blind loyalty to his father, Dutch, who by token is really the entire gang. The gang is named after him, he has the finest clothes and even the most luxurious tent out of all the other members. To go against Dutch is to go against the gang. It's best to just slide into the position he knows best, being an unquestionable brute, something everyone says he is. Most of all, is Hosea. Almost every single mission or interaction Arthur has with Hosea, he's quick to call Arthur big and dumb. Clearly by the contents of Arthur's journal, Arthur can write pretty elegantly, he's educated on the level of being able to read and even draw. Things that aren't as widespread as they are nowadays. Later events in the game show he is capable of empathy, compassion, remorse, and even understanding of the greater repercussions tied to his actions or lack thereof. Yet all of this is pushed aside, not just in the early hours of the game, but prior to the events of the game. It's quite clear that by the time culture rolls around, everyone is older and practically set in their ways, which means that while Arthur's choices on the outside may not be exactly representative of Dutch's teachings that, at least prior to the events of the game, involve not killing innocent people or chasing the fool's mission of revenge, if we are to believe Dutch and the rest of the gang members actually practice what he preached, it would then be safe to say the ruthlessness in which he pursues Downs Denton, his threatening demeanor towards Jimmy Brooks, or even threatening Kieran after being quote-unquote lied to, would all just be a small representation of how he was and probably always has been. Whether if it was strictly for the gang's benefit and had no emotional investment behind it or personal inclination to give into his own rage, something that is hard to say exactly because we don't see too many instances of Arthur being rageful or succumbing to his own emotions outside anger from the usual suspects such as Micah and Milton, or in the rare occasion of wanting to kill Kieran for quote-unquote lying, or later on in the game when he throws Strauss out of camp out of revulsion from all the jobs Strauss was providing. Either way, the point is I'm trying to say here is there is no doubt he had blind loyalty to Dutch, and much of his actions is of course owed to just listening and refusing to think for himself on some level, but that doesn't fully excuse him. He's not morally bankrupt. In the transition from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point, Charles and Arthur come across a woman and her two small children. Their father had been kidnapped, most likely is going to be killed, and without a doubt is a frightening ordeal for the wife and cowering children who have taken refuge underneath this wagon. Arthur doesn't hesitate to send them on their way, shouting he needs their land. Charles intervenes, asks the children where their father is, and scolds Arthur on their way to rescue him.
What's going on with you?
What do you mean?
You were just going to send that woman and her children on their way?
We're wanted men. We got Pinkertons breathing down our necks. We should be moving camp, not running off on some wild goose chase.
Come on, Arthur. That's not how you are.
Well, maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do.
Now in the moment, Arthur puts up a fair argument, and of course, it's a justifiable excuse. Milton and Ross surprised Arthur and Jack a few days ago by camp, and almost immediately after this, Dutch, Arthur, and John shoot up the town of Valentine. There's too much heat and way too much attention for the two of them to postpone the resettlement of the gang for a grand rescue mission. It's a small thing that's easily overlooked because it's not brought up again, nor is it really given that much attention in the moment. Something I want to point out though, is I feel it is crucial to the point that I'm trying to make here, is even if Arthur is fiercely loyal, he's not lacking self-awareness or reflection. If you take a look at Arthur's journal, he highlights this event specifically, sharing how much he laments at the constant battle of quote-unquote good and evil inside of him, and wishes good just came to him as easily as it does to Charles. This is long before he's ever sick or aware of how sick he is. The fate that awaits him is long ahead of his own knowledge. He's not yet confronted with the bitter reality of being human. And as we are human, we all have our expiration date. During Beaver Hollow, he makes attempts to help out Edith and Archie Downs, people that could be seen, at least from their own eyes, had their lives ruined at the hands of Arthur. Arthur forgives Londonderry's family for the debt they owe, perhaps in a twisted way, reminding him of the state he found the Downs family in after the death of Thomas. Arthur even helps out the nun and other religious figures in Saint Denis. He makes it clear at least once he's not a religious man.
I guess I'm just hoping for a dignified exit.
I shall pray for you.
Oh, I'm not a religious man, sister. I'm an outlaw.
While making a handful of statements time and again that he's not looking for forgiveness or any type of salvation, he knows he is, by his definition, a horrible person, and on some level he is. He is of his own free will after all, and can only attribute some of his worst offenses as something deemed totally necessary for the gang's survival. Even then, you could argue you always have a choice. A choice he actively ignored. It wasn't until he was faced with his own mortality, the love of Mary Linton resurfacing and moving on again, topped off with his respect within his family starting to rapidly dwindle. Even if Rockstar chose to kill off Arthur with tuberculosis, I don't believe the level of love or sympathy would have been achieved for Arthur as it was if it wasn't for these instances of vulnerability. Sure, Arthur's journal gives added depth and some extra insight into the mind of Dutch's most ruthless gunmen, some added food for thought, something else to explore behind the scenes, but if it wasn't for the way Rockstar humanizes Arthur over time, from Mary's involvement to how he bonds with Lenny and Hosea, the soft spot he has for John that comes off as nothing but anger and resentment at the beginning of the game. Resentment that turns out to be nothing more than hurt and a sense of betrayal, similar to how a sibling would be disappointed for being so easily thrown away by another sibling. While Arthur has the saddest, most peaceful endings of all time, the question for you remains, did Arthur manage to redeem himself in the small amount of time he finally broke free from Dutch's illusions? Or is even death as peaceful as this too respectful for a man that's dedicated his life to brutality, executing whatever means necessary to achieve the paradise he wholeheartedly believed in? Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of, if not the greatest game of all time. For me personally, it is my favorite game of all time. It's one that I had always gone to, and frankly still do, whenever I want to just torment random NPCs, relax by just exploring the game's open world, or just sit back and enjoy a great story. And the story of Red Dead Redemption 2 is one that only gets deeper and more complex after multiple runs. It's really a game that I would say you should play it for multiple runs, because Rockstar's writing within the game's story, the characters, and the interactions between them, there's so many different small nuances and details you can pick up on your 4th, 5th, or in my case, your 6th playthrough that you won't get on your 1st or even your 2nd. Not to mention taking your time and running into strangers you missed on your 1st run.
You should keep that thing in a cage.
You should think about who you're serving.
Give me a beer, will you?
Or exploring a particular landmark as Arthur, for him to just illustrate and jot down that landmark or that person he ran into, to then revisit said journal entry years later in the game's epilogue as a John. It makes the world and the overall narrative feel that much more connected to the feeling we as real genuine people experience as loss and regret. Obviously, we played as Arthur, so we've seen him meet these people, we've seen him be at these locations, and we know what his reaction was like and what was going through his head at the time. And even if we don't, we're given a little bit of insight due to whatever thoughts and feelings he might have written down on the page. But from John's perspective, it's just, oh man, Arthur really met these people, he's been here, he's seen these things, and it just shows John's perspective in a point of view that we are all familiar with. It's a position of just being at the mercy of our own imagination.
That made it so tender. You know what? This place used to be a pig farm when we was kids. Before we lost our ma and pa. Horrible business.
Horrible.
But we still got each other, ain't that right, honey pie?
And we still know how to have a hog killing time.
Here, that's for you.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
Right now, I am currently in my 5th or 6th playthrough of the story, and that's basically because I thought I had 100%ed a previous run, but I didn't. I'm missing quite a bit of stuff that I thought I had collected before, and the reason why I feel it's so important to try to collect everything in one run is because you get Arthur's introspection. You get to see into his mind, his thoughts, his opinions on all these little things you collect as him. And I typically am the kind of person to just want to explore and find everything on my own. And unfortunately, this game is so damn massive with so many secrets and encounters to miss that it's just impossible to try and do all of that naturally. To find everything on your own in the appropriate timeline of the game's main story is damn near impossible, or you gotta be incredibly lucky. You have to consult with videos and articles online if you wish to find everything at the appropriate time, or at what might feel like the appropriate time. But through all the nuances of the game's story, how well the world and various environments within this game are beautifully crafted, and how great the characters such as Dutch van der Linde, Arthur Morgan, Micah Bell, and the various other members of the van der Linde gang are written, on top of their corresponding relationships between all of them and the gang at large. There are of course some things the game can be criticized for. People have pointed out plot holes. At times some things are left so vague it begs the question of whether if this game's narrative is really meant to be analyzed, the way myself and so many others have done before. And there's many things to be desired in the sections of Guarma, and even the epilogue itself. It's one thing to want the game to strive to do more. Trust me, this game does plenty already, and it does a lot of it very well. So well, in fact, it's difficult to even fathom how much further they could take it. But wanting the game to do more, or wishing certain parts provided either more gameplay opportunities or greater amounts of lore for the Red Dead universe at large, or, in my case, wishing some characters were used a little bit more, further developing their characters or their importance to the story or their connection to Arthur Morgan. But that's all an entirely different thing from when you misunderstand what the game does not want to be. Over the past few weeks, I've been putting out some community posts comparing Arthur to other van der Linde gang members, most notably John Marston. While those have been collecting many different votes, opinions, and perspectives on comparing the two protagonists of the Red Dead Redemption games, I've been going back and forth between the two games, preparing for a few videos regarding John Marston and his own journey of redemption in the first game, and contrasting that to Arthur's story of personal transformation that we see in the second. Both games have a few connecting points and main themes that I think have become staples of the Red Dead series, things that we are practically going to be expecting in any future installments, most notably the personal transformation of that game's main protagonist. It's a story that can always be taken up from different angles, but so far what we have seen are stories of the main protagonists doing their best at, well, redemption. Both Arthur and John do what they could to make up for their past decisions, lives they led that would be considered less than honorable. The nuances, circumstances, and desired outcome of the two are vastly different though. Arthur's life is on a clock. There's no hope for any kind of life that isn't tied to the ultimate fate of the van der Linde gang. Arthur's basically a walking dead man. He strives to make up for his past decisions and the person that he was by attempting to do as much good or perform as many things that were much more ethically sound, leading to a rich complex story of questioning if Arthur was ever a bad guy, or If he was just so loyal, it was a character flaw. Arthur had a level of loyalty and love for his family and adopted father. He was all too willing to put his own ethics aside, not think twice about it, and just do what he was told. John, in some contexts, can be seen as not so noble with his intentions. Arthur tried to do good with any and everyone in his dying days. You could say that was selfish in of itself. A case of a little too late, desperately trying to do good anywhere he could just to alleviate a little of his own personal shame and guilt. John, in some ways, is a little more ruthless than Arthur. Now, we don't spend as much time with John as we do with Arthur. I think that's due to how evolved games have become, developing richer stories and more complex characters. Rockstar was possibly also just getting a feel for how a game like the original Red Dead Redemption would do, and that would explain why in some cases the original Red Dead Redemption game feels a little bit more like a Wild West game at times than the sequel does. While the sequel takes place years before the first game feels a lot more barren. It feels a lot more like when you help the law, you're rewarded appropriately, versus in the sequel, when you try to help the law, if you don't act the way the law feels like you should, you're automatically reprimanded. There's a few instances out in the open world, but to really compare the two one-to-one, you can just look at how both games handle bounties. John can accept a bounty and bring them back dead or alive. Alive will fetch you the bounty's full price, dead, the sheriff will still take it, but it cuts your bounty's price in half. John's fame and honor goes up, and we all move on. The sequel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost entirely certain every single bounty has to be brought in alive. And that's not to mention the whole fame level is completely gone. So the idea of a legendary, infamous, or famous figure of the Wild West days are almost entirely omitted from the second game. Add in how weirdly difficult it is to bomb your honor level versus increasing it, and how bounty hunters seemingly always pop up out of the blue whenever you want to start a mission or interact with a stranger, and it just feels as if everything points towards Arthur's story leaning in a way that, outside of the main events of the game, show him as a good guy. The first game is always described as Grand Theft Auto with horses, or Grand Theft Auto in the Wild West. While that is inaccurate, the second game I've heard been described as an outlaw simulator. That is also entirely inaccurate. There's too many things set within this game that don't make that a reality. And that isn't really what the game is trying to do. What the game is trying to do, at least how I see it, is trying to create a world that best imitates how life was lived back in the 1800s. At the turn of the century, when outlaws, gunslingers, bandits, and weapon smugglers were on their way out, slowly smothered by the growing power of law enforcement and the gradual backing that law enforcement received from the local populace, tired of the bullying and harassment of the outlaws. Arthur may have been a bad guy, a ruthless, cold-blooded killer, and while that was still in him, and he was all too willing and capable to do whatever was necessary to survive, when we see him at this point in his life, he's not that much of a killer anymore. He's older, he's wiser, his family and himself are put to a test that none of them have ever had to face before. It's a world shown through the eyes of someone who was on the receiving end of being stomped out, someone who had their own internal struggles with what was right and what was wrong, only to have more pressure added on through the death sentence of tuberculosis. Game developers add in and remove stuff that makes sense narratively and gameplay wise. I think having such an aggressive bounty system with bounty hunters seemingly always popping up is a manifestation of a world that doesn't want them anymore. But it's also a gameplay addition to make sure you walk the straight and narrow, because holy shit can they get annoying. Some things, such as the fame bar in the first game, at a time much later when the world and law enforcement were even better equipped and had a stronger grasp on these wildlands, does seem a bit odd. But if we were to forget the vision in the game and what the devs had in mind, or even the technical limitations, and just look at it from strictly a gameplay perspective, contributing to understanding each character, their morals, their values, their actual goals, that would also mean that fame and infamy is technically important to John, which we could say is because Jack read so much about Legends of the Wild West and of course the wonderful stories of King Arthur and his knights. In John's perspective, maybe he just wants to make it into one of those books so that one day he could have that connection with his son, a connection that he tried so hard to have at the end of the first game and even during the epilogue of the second. But of course, that's just my perspective, my opinion, and I want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Is there anything else you want to add to this conversation? Am I spewing just BS and talking nonsense? Let me hear your thoughts down below. And like always, I want to take this time to thank you for watching yet another video, as well as wishing you all a happy new year. It's been a fantastic last few months, and I probably have another video coming up talking about that and the future of the channel. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all technically next year. Have a happy new year and a safe one.